Sorry guys, I forgot to press the record. Okay. Sorry guys, I forgot to press the record. Let's do American the first serial killer family.
The year is 1871, and a lonesome traveler is making his way on horseback through the state of Kansas, hoping to head west where he's heard there's money to be made. As he's passing through the Great Osage Trail, drained after days navigating windswept plains, he comes across what looks like a quiet homestead. There, he meets the Bender family, an odd-looking group of people if there ever was one. Unbeknownst to the daring traveler, Old Man Bender has quite the reputation among the few families that live in the remote area. What do people say about him? They call him a hideous brute, ill-tempered, repulsive. As for Mrs. Bender, she's called a midnight hag with murderous ambition. Indeed, after his belly was full of stew and his head had hit the pillow, the traveler's life came to an abrupt end. He was found some days later dumped near a creek with his throat slashed and his skull crushed. This is the story of the Blood Benders, America's first serial killer family. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. This was a time in U.S. history when European settlers were trying to make a go of it in the sometimes quite remote and unforgiving parts of America. The Bender family was no exception. They arrived in Osage in northwestern Labette County in the year 1870, along with a handful of other families. The locals didn't exactly welcome them with open arms, but neither did they turn their backs to them. They were just another bunch of folks that were going to see just how hard it was settling in such a harsh environment. It was just too much for some of the new families, and they packed up and left quickly.
Oh,
But
this is a
The
killer
Benders were made of tough stuff. They weren't going anywhere. John Bender Sr. made a claim on
birthday
some land
weekly
adjacent to the Great Osage
for
Trail, which would later
day
become known as the Santa Fe Trail. It was Native Americans who
day
forged the
9.
trail, but it was Europeans who had made the Osage Trail. If a person back then wanted to move west along an open road, then they had to pass through this trail and at some point come close to the warped homestead of the Bender family. The Benders soon got their hands dirty and built a barn, a corral, and a cabin. The cabin had two rooms, only separated by the cloth of a wagon cover. They made a kitchen and they converted part of their cabin into a general store and a place a traveler could have a bite to eat. On top of that, they made a small compartment where someone could rest their head for the night. You could call it a bed, but it deserved to be called a butcher's block. So, who were the Benders exactly? Well, we know that John Bender Sr., aka Pa, could barely speak a word of English. We knew that he grunted a lot, and to those who met him, he was seen as something of a brute. They were right. Mrs. Bender, Elvira, aka Ma, was said to be equally unfriendly, and while better than her husband, her English wasn't perfect. Both her and John communicated most of the time in German. She was sometimes called a she-devil, but not because of her appearance, but because along with her daughter, she told anyone in the area that she had psychic powers and could even communicate with the dead. That daughter, Kate Bender, was the only family member who was fluent in English, and so she was very useful when it came to writing and distributing flyers that explained that she and her mother were advocates of spiritualism and could heal the sick with their supernatural powers. As for the son, John Jr., word on the street was, or shall we say the trail, was that he was a half-wit, a young man prone to sudden outbreaks of laughter for no apparent reason. Some sources state that the brother and sister were not actually related, but a married couple. This is the problem with the story of the Benders. The family was something of a mystery. There was never any documentation stating that they were German immigrants. This was just taken for granted. It may or may not have been true, just as the rumor that Mrs. Bender had actually come from the Adirondack Mountains in New York State and that she'd killed previous husbands might not have been true. They were a weird bunch, a family that promoted free love, who claimed that they could talk to dead spirits. For that reason, they were gossiped about a lot. It didn't help their reputation.
Destiny.
Bender gave lectures on spiritualism, and during those lectures, she would sometimes say that murder might not be such a bad thing. It might actually be a brave and noble act. She also advocated free love, saying that staying with one partner alone was just the miserable requirements of self-constituted society. Notably, she also once said in one of her lectures, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." As you can imagine, folks that lived near the Benders were somewhat apprehensive about making friends with them. You had the brute of a father, his wicked wife, the idiot son, and a daughter that claimed she was in contact with the dead and didn't believe in any kind of sexual propriety. They were outcasts, strange sounding pariahs living in the middle of nowhere, and so people kept their distance. But travelers, people looking for a new life in the American West, they knew nothing about the Bender family. They just wanted a place to rest their head for a night or two and a good meal to restore their energy. The Bender homestead was like an oasis to these travelers, and they were only too happy to have a place to stay, to be able to fill their wagons with food, water, gunpowder, booze, and tobacco. Not only that, they were reportedly entranced by Kate's good looks and her way with words. Come rest, she told them. I will heal you with my psychic powers. Healing was far from the truth. Traveling down that trail was not for the meek. Not only could a person or a group of people starve out there, but they needed their strength and they needed weapons if they should come into contact with bandits or unfriendly Native Americans. Let's not forget that many groups were traveling with everything they owned. That's why when the young man we described in the beginning of the story was found with his throat slashed and his head caved in, it wasn't exactly a big shock to people. Everyone knew that the trail was a treacherous place, and one could easily be set upon by a gang who wanted what was in their wagon. In 1871, 72, and 73, people went missing, always close to where the Benders lived. The locals at the time grew quite worried. People were told not to go out on the trail alone or at night, but no one suspected that it was the Bender family that was behind the strange disappearances. In fact, mobs at times would accuse some man down on his luck and proceed to chase him out of town. They would soon discover that they'd been chasing away the wrong people. In March 1873, a physician from Independence, Kansas, named Dr. William York, alighted a train in Cherryvale, a town not too far from the Osage Trail. This guy was a person of standing, so when he went missing, it was big news. What was he doing in the middle of nowhere, you might ask? York had made the journey because he was looking for two people that had gone missing. Those two folks had been acquainted with York, and he was determined to find them. The friend was George Newton Longcourt, and he was accompanied by his young daughter, Mary Ann. They left Independence with the hope of resettling in Iowa, except they didn't get very
Iowa.
far. They found the
Okay.
Osage Trail and later
Yeah.
moved here.
There
We
was
know
in
that on
Native
his quest to
Iowa.
find his friend and his friend's daughter, that York arrived at a place called
Native
Fort
folks,
Scott
sorry.
near Kansas. We know that on March 9th he left that place. We also know that he never made it home from there. What the Bender family didn't know is that they had now bitten off more than they could chew. You see, Mr. York wasn't just a man of standing. His two brothers were also extremely powerful people. One was a colonel in the military, and the other was a member of the Kansas State Senate. Those two guys were obviously upset that their brother had vanished into thin air, a brother that had been looking for other people that had vanished. While the brothers at first thought that the disappearances might have been down to attacks by Native Americans, they also wondered if some of those homesteads contained something quite insidious.
See, that
What
guy
they were
cut
about to
his
discover was something way
cellulite.
more evil than they had
I
bargained
don't
for,
like when people
something
call
that would
them
shock America
Indians
for many years to come. They got 50 guys together
because
and went
that's
out to visit those homesteads,
disrespectful.
arriving along the tracks like a small army. At one point, the group, led by the brother who was a colonel in the U.S. Army, arrived at Bender's place. He spoke to the family, well, as best he could do, since the older Benders were terrible with English, and he was told that his brother had stayed the night with them, but he'd left the next day. The Benders told the colonel that the trail was fraught with danger, and his brother might have come across dangerous natives. There was just something wrong about the family, and Colonel York grew more suspicious when he learned that Mrs. Bender had recently threatened someone with a knife. We know that it did indeed happen because the newspaper clipping still exists today. The colonel went back and again asked, "Do you know where my brother is?" He was rather less friendly this time. Mrs. Bender was enraged that the men were back, while Kate Bender told him that she'd use her clairvoyant skills to find the missing man. At that point, the colonel and his men were pretty sure that this family were not what they claimed to be. In fact, some of the men in the group said that they were guilty and should be hanged. But the colonel needed more evidence before he sent the family to the gallows, and they went to talk to more people in nearby communities. Weeks passed, and then one local noticed something strange. He passed the Bender house and realized that the place seemed to be abandoned. It looked like the Benders had just taken off, leaving some of their animals behind. That man reported what he'd seen to the members of the township, and soon the colonel heard about the missing family. Due to terrible weather, it took some days to go out and search for the Benders, but in the end, a search party of several hundred people was formed. When they got to the Bender house, they discovered that it was pretty much empty of clothes and provisions. All that had been left behind was something that smelled awful, as if a decaying body was under the floorboards. The men found a trap door that was bolted shut, but they soon managed to wrestle it open. The door led to a dark room under the house, and there they saw blood splattered everywhere, some of it not so old. The group moved to the cabin and they started digging, thinking that bodies must be buried. Later that evening, they found Dr. York's decomposing body. He'd been buried in the nearby orchard. The next day, they found another 8 bodies buried in shallow graves. When they looked down the well, they found another body as well as various body parts. It was a horror show, a terrible thing to behold. Some of the bodies had been mutilated, while the body of a young girl didn't seem to have been injured at all. The group suspected that the family had buried her alive. In all, the Benders might have killed as many as 21 people, although a more conservative estimate is 11. The Benders had a few good friends in that area, but suffice to say, the now growing crowd of people weren't too kind to folks that had known the family. One man was hanged just because he knew them, although the crowd pulled him down and he survived. The media arrived at the Bender place, coming from as far away as New York City and Chicago. The public came from far and wide, all wanting to look at the place where the evil had lived. Rewards were offered to anyone who could locate the family, which in today's money were around $20,000 and $40,000. But where were the Benders? Well, vigilantes wanted that reward, with some claiming they had caught up with the family and killed them all. Some claimed they shot and buried them, others said they shot and threw them in the river, but these were all likely lies. No bodies were found and no reward was given. The Benders were either very good at hiding or they were all 6 feet under. The reward then went up to more than $60,000 in today's money, but still no one could find them. As this was happening, the story spread to every state. Books were written, including one called The Five Fiends or The Bender Hotel Horror in Kansas. It wasn't easy finding this family for the simple fact that not much was known about them. Were the parents legally married? Were the children even their children? Were they even called Benders? It was soon speculated that Mr. Bender was actually named John Flickinger, and that Mrs. Bender had likely been married several times. Worse, her husbands always seemed to end up dead with wounds to the head, and it was likely that Kate and John Jr. were the children of some of those men, and their real names were Eliza Griffith and John Gebhardt. Where did they all go? We just don't know. Their story remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in U.S. history. Maybe they were killed by an angry posse, but if they were, no bodies were ever recovered, and no one claimed that handsome reward. They might also have moved west, started another life, and then filled the ground with more bodies. Maybe their descendants are living next door to you right now, just waiting to carry on their murderous legacy. Now, you need to see this: the most shocking unsolved murders in the world.
Hey, guys, I will see you my video, so I see you then.